Okay.
So just go to your home screen on Instagram. I'll go live and I'll show up as a little icon which will say live. So just click on that and then I'll invite you to join the chat and then you can just accept the invite and we're good.
Okay.
Sounds complicated. It's not. Promise.
No, it's okay. It's fine.
Hi guys. Welcome to Unplugged Talk series. I'm just going to add in Kamal Malik and Arjun Malik to join us for today's episode. Arjun, can you see me on Insta?
Yes, I can see you on Insta.
Okay. Great. So there you are.
Can you, because I can't see what you're seeing.
I've just found you and I have invited you to join.
Okay, so there we are. All right.
Yeah. Okay. So just before we start, I'd like to welcome everyone to yet another episode of the Unplugged Talks. This is an initiative by Matra Architects. Mrinalini and myself, we co-curate this series. And today we're joined by Kamal and Arjun Malik. We're having some, I'm saying pause due to poor connection. Arjun, you're still online?
Yes, I can see you. And
okay, so I think it'll just take a while to kind of smoothen out. But yeah, we've got a bunch of people who are joining us today. And like we've mentioned before, the Unplugged series is basically a series of conversations that we have with creative people and where we want to talk to them about what they do, why they do it, and how they do it, and to kind of peel back the layers and get to know what the reason is and what their personal journeys have been in informing their work and informing the way they function today. So this is our 5th episode, and today we've got from Malik Architecture in Bombay, Arjun and Kamal. Some issues with Instagram, I believe. Technical issues will come and go. People who are on Instagram, I would actually encourage you to join us on Zoom or YouTube. We're live on Zoom and YouTube right now. My colleague Siddhant is going to share some details. So in case you want to register, you can do that. Siddhant, if you can share the details on the Instagram feed. And we will be taking questions through the conversation. So feel free to send in your comments and your questions, and we'll try to incorporate them within the conversation that we're having today. So before I begin, I want to first welcome Mr. Malik and Arjun. Thank you so much for taking out your time, for sparing a Saturday afternoon and joining us today. We're looking forward to an exciting conversation with both of you.
It's our pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thanks so much, guys, for inviting us.
So I'm going to give you a very quick introduction. I don't think neither of you need much of an introduction, but I'm just going to quickly read out something that we've written and then we'll dive right into the conversation. As most of you know, Malik Architecture is a multi-disciplinary practice based in Mumbai, known for its diverse portfolio of works that ranges from residential to institutional, hospitality, healthcare, a lot of different things that you guys have done over the last, close to 4 decades. The firm was established in 1975 by Mr. Malik and 30 years later joined by Arjun. While one started his career in engineering and was soon swayed into architecture for its greater balance, I believe, in the sciences and the arts. The other one clearly knew from a much younger age that this was his calling and this is what he wanted to do. But together they have created a practice that attempts to develop a very relevant contemporary syntax of architecture for the subcontinent. It is articulated by architecture as a synthesis of what they call ecology and spirit. And while they tether themselves to these values, they both bring to the table ideologies that stem from their personal journeys, whether it's a childhood steeped in nature or international exposure to radical intellectual thinking and even intuition. But what is most exciting to begin with is that while I have introduced both the Maliks today in a very architectural context, I believe, Mr. Malik, if I were to meet you at a social gathering, let's say a dinner, that's not how you would introduce yourself, would it?
Well, I think the first thing that somebody would ask you is, what do you do? Okay. And you would expect a response that I am an architect. You will not get that from me, because architecture is what I do, but it's not all of what I am.
Right.
So this is one aspect of things, because this actually stems from a slightly deeper understanding of Eastern thought, which is where we come from, right? And also, to an extent, my background. I would, so if I was to introduce myself, it would simply be that this is something that I do, but I am a lot of things, right?
And we hope to find out a little bit about those different things over the course of the next hour or so.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Arjun, how would you define yourself? How would you introduce yourself? What do you think defines who you are?
I really can't answer that question, to be honest. I think, again, what I do is what I do. Who I am is, who I am. And I mean, I'm really not into trying to even get remotely close, if as obtuse as they may be to definition. Why? I mean, different people are different things at different times. Why limit yourself? If that's the direction of the conversation, chances are I point to someone I know and I just kind of slip away. Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting way. So no introduction at all, maybe.
Yeah, I think it takes place gradually, right? You don't want to lay it out on the table, right at the start.
Okay, so we're going to have to take time to kind of peel off your layers a little bit. Okay, fine. So a little more effort with you, clearly. Okay, so I want to get into, of course, both of you being architects and, our association, having known both of you as from the design community. But to kind of get into a little bit of how you got into, both of you individually, how you both got into the idea of design, or what made you come into the sort of purview of architecture. But before that, also what your childhood was like. So I believe, Mr. Malik, you grew up in the hills. You were very close to nature. You used to go riding every day. And that has been something that has influenced you. Whereas Arjun, you have been more of a city boy. You've been, brought up in an urban environment in the maximum city of Bombay, what is often described as a concrete jungle. So two very, very different contexts and different sort of upbringings. So could we talk a little bit about those from each one of you?
Yeah, I think I just hark back a wee bit to my childhood, because those first 7 years, and psychologists now will tell you that those 7 years are really your formative years. So many things happened. It is not only that I was up in the mountains in the Himalayas surrounded by forest. No, it wasn't. It was many things put together. I had a father who was in the army, and they are posted every 3 years. They change stations, and I stayed back there. I was brought up by grandparents. That is point number 2 that happened. Okay. Point number 3, that it was very rare from our perch on the hill where our house was to see a car, to see a motor car. You would see perhaps 2 in the day. And all that you heard was the mule trains, the mules with the tinkling of the bells. You witnessed closely the change of the seasons and the cyclical nature, the aspect of nature. So all of those things actually start to affect you, right? And if you really look at it, you ask yourself a question that what is nature? We are always looking at it as 2 separate things, man and nature. But have we ever thought for a moment that we are an intrinsic part of it. We are not separate from it.
Right.
So that's once you come to that kind of an understanding, then what is the language of communication with nature becomes the next step. And as we move along, we will also discuss these things, that how they start to impact, right? As far as my getting into architecture and design is concerned, believe me, it would be dishonest of me to say that there was an intent.
Really?
I went in, I did a year of engineering, didn't quite gel. My dad, who was in the army, thought that the best career is to go to the army, right? And then somewhere, this opportunity of being able to use, to have this combination, which I came to love as we went along later, of science and art, poetry and science, both of them, as they come together, that started to. So that's how I really went into architecture. So it was not really some great dream I had that I'm going to, be an architect. No.
So it was a slower discovery for you.
Absolutely.
But Arjun, you? A very different sort of childhood, right? I mean, probably didn't hear the tinkering bells of mules outside your house, but different kinds of bells, perhaps.
Not so, yeah. Different kinds of bells, not so many mules, lots of donkeys. Let's not go there. So, look, we're extremely fortunate that even though, I grew up in Bombay, and it's all about, and every time you hear about Bombay, you talk about, diversity and energy and, constantly moving, right? We're very fortunate that because I'm essentially from an army background. My grandfather, most of dad's extended cousins, etc. They're all from the armed forces or Air Force or Navy. So we stay in Navy Nagar in Bombay. That's where I grew up. That's where I'm back now after the entire journey. It still is, but it was extremely quiet. Right, we're very fortunate. We live on the sea, facing east. So it's not about the blank ocean that goes dead at night. It's constantly animated with little fishing boats, ships coming in and out of the harbor. As the land turns, it goes from Nava Shiva, Murud, Alibag. You can actually see the hills that move past. So in a sense, the communication with nature was there, perhaps not as extreme as being in the Himalayas, but that sense of anchoring or quiet or being associated with the quiet depths of water was always there. So that really nicely balanced out all the other, frenetic activities of childhood. So I don't think I grew up in the Bombay that most people recognize. My Bombay was very, very different to, the image Bombay that people
So
have.
it wasn't the chaotic sort of density that people relate to with Bombay, but it was still a little distant from that.
I think so, because where we stay in Navy Nagar and where I went to school, close to Fort and I went to Campion. Look, as a child, it's your, the distances even then, okay, they seemed huge. I mean, what was essentially a 6 to 7 minute drive from the perspective of a small child, it just felt like, how would you get there? But then finally transitioning from the school bus, possibly to a bicycle, then to public transport. The point is Bombay was a lot cleaner, a lot emptier. Sure. I'm sure before us, people in the 50s, 60s, 70s would have said that, okay, your Bombay in the 80s and 90s is far more dirty and polluted. I think
that's an ever-changing sort of, yeah.
But I think maybe looking back now, and in hindsight, especially now that I have a 7-year-old and my sister has 3 kids and we all live in the same building, I think you're kind of a little bit more aware now of the kind of white noise that may have surrounded you. I don't remember it from then, but I can sense now that being growing up in nature would have been very different to constantly being surrounded with that noise that causes you to constantly, build up your filters and shut things out. And when you shut things out, you shut things, the good and the bad out.
Right.
As far as one would imagine that dad would, be passionately communicating with me about architecture and, the beauty of the discipline and its social mission and all about the fantastic people that have come before and the potential of architecture, but he never brought his work home. So
really, I was going to ask, did he ever talk shop at dinner? No.
Never. My association or my impression of architecture was if you're good at drawing, right, and that drawing turns into a building, and therefore right through school, it wasn't in a sense, it was a natural progression. I could say very clearly that there was no passion for it growing up. It did not enamel me. It did not intrigue me. It was more like a natural path. Papa karte hain, so it's a profession. Chalo, let's go. I thought, it might not be that difficult. Let's go ahead and do it. I was in for a very, very rude shock. So whilst people may have epiphanies about the profession, I can tell you that he talks about the gradual build-up. Mine was even slower into something far more strong and resilient, but it came over many, many, many years when I finally first in architecture school, a little sense of dignity and pride kicked in that, my father is an architect. I shouldn't be performing in such an abysmal manner. My professors and classmates will testify to this. So part of it was just kind of saving face, but I think gradually things started to take root in a different manner. And I could not imagine anything different now, but back in the day, I always envisioned myself being a professional sports person. And that's a different story. It went off at a different tangent.
That's interesting. I'm going to come back to that because I know there are commonalities between the two of you in that sense as well. But I did want to ask, because we're talking about the city, Mr. Malik, you went from, being in the hills and having spent a large part of your childhood there to coming to Delhi, and where you studied at the SPA and then moving to Bombay. So Delhi kind of seems like the stepping stone towards going into this extremely urban city, right? And what would probably be known as the quintessential city of India today is probably Bombay, and people argue that. A lot of Delhiites would disagree, but I think that's like the general consensus. But what was it like for you to transition from this non-urban space to what some would call a semi-urban to a highly urban, and then decide to stick on for the next 40 years?
I think let's take Delhi, right? You're absolutely correct in assuming that it was a kind of intermediate stepping stone. And there we were in Delhi cantonment, if you are aware of it.
Yes, very familiar.
Again, verdant green.
Yeah.
We were just next to, there was a St. Martin's church there. I don't know if you've ever been as an architect. It's a very beautiful church there, built in exposed brick. We were just next to it.
Okay.
And after the first year or so, I would use a mobike to go to ITO, to the college.
Wow, that's quite a distance.
Okay, yeah.
Huh.
So first year was bus, and which was quite an experience, because in Delhi you had to guess where the bus would stop. Never at the bus stop. It was either there or there.
Nothing has changed.
Holding the drawings and anticipating where to go was a kind of challenge of sorts. And but with SPA itself, which we will sort of we can return to that, right? So that was Delhi, not so bad. Huh? Then
that's good to hear, coming for a Delhiite, yes.
Yeah. No, but as I said, we were that part of Delhi, which wasn't Delhi. Now, for example, I would take a cycle and go all the way up the Ridge Road. I won't encounter a human being.
Right.
Take my air gun, and I won't tell you what we were doing with that gun, but that's off the record, right? But as an army officer's son, he thought that the least we could do was do some killing,
Oh
So, but
no.
anyway, that's
Ouch.
Public platform.
so. Um, so it was actually very pristine. The whole of Malcha Marg and the left of it, where the 61st Cavalry is,
Yes.
it was complete forest. It is almost even today.
It
The
is.
left of
It's
Malcha,
still quite reserved.
Marg
Yes.
is still there. So really, it wasn't that much of a cultural shock. Coming to Bombay, yes, that was because yes.
But what brought
there
you to
is,
Bombay?
Oh, very interesting. You see, my dad, we are somewhere very distantly connected with the Oberois.
Okay.
He built his first hotel in Simla. And my grandfather was in the civil service. So he knew Mohan Singh Oberoi. We are talking about Mr. Bicky
Yes.
Oberoi's father.
Yes.
I'm talking about going back into time, And they were good friends. And when my dad retired, he was given an offer that why don't you come down and look after our export-import department for the Oberois.
Okay.
That's how we really came to Mumbai. And somewhere we kind of followed and stayed on. So really, this also, sheds light on a subject which I believe in. Here it is. There was no rational reason for me ever to come from there to Delhi to Mumbai. Absolutely not.
So it wasn't a planned move. It wasn't something that you had kind of charted out for yourself.
Certainly
it
not.
Just happened.
So you're just meant to be where you're meant to be.
That's interesting. Would you imagine yourself being anywhere else instead?
Hypothetical questions, but as we go along, yes, I will tell you, where all we are hoping to work in the next couple of years.
Oh, exciting!
And then but I think the cycle started in the hills will go back to the hills. Yeah.
Really? So we're heading back up north then. That's good too. We'll probably have a little stopover in Delhi again, I hope. It's a very different city now, but you'll still find its charms in little corners every now and then, I hope. But I want to talk to you both about, again, it's interesting because when we have our conversation today, a lot of it is running parallelly, just the fact that we're talking to two different generations, but who've had very similar paths, but in completely different contexts. So and then, you kind of come and you converge at some point, which is back at your own practice. So I did want to kind of shed some light on, or ask you to shed some light on your educational training, where you've been at the SPA and you've worked and you've been surrounded by some very, very influential and very strong personalities. You had mentioned in our previous conversation that, you were interacting and engaging with people like Tayyab Mehta and Krishna Khanna, and your thesis guide, if I'm not mistaken, was Bruno D'Souza.
Bruno D'Souza, yeah.
Right. And Arjun, you, on the other hand, went from Rachna Sansad to Columbia, which is, again, one of the most prestigious universities in the world today. It's counted amongst the top. And you were engaging with some of the most radical thinkers and, educationists of your time and over there. So it'd be interesting to draw sort of, well, not parallels, but to see the kind of different engagements that both of you had in your respective areas.
Right.
Let either one.
So when I went to SPA, they had moved into the new building.
If I can just clarify for our audience, what year was this? Just to get some sort of context.
66.
Okay.
Okay. If my memory serves me right. It had moved, it used to be called the Kashmiri Gate Polytechnic.
Right.
And then it had shifted and become the SPA, that 5-storied structure which it is today. And then town planning came later. On the turning. The fact that at that point of time, there was a huge number of people who are considered good architects, teaching us. There was Rajrewal, there was Kanminde, there was Ajoy Chowdhury, Ranjit Sabiki, Murad Chowdhury, it's Kuldeep Singh, Shivnag Prasad. There is a whole lot of names, okay, who were stalwarts at that point of time. And I think they did do good work.
Right.
So one was that you were actually being subjected to a fairly high standard of people, of architects. That is number one. Number two, we had as our head of department a Professor Jhabwala. It's very interesting. If anybody has read Heat and Dust by Ruth Prower Jhabwala, that was his wife, Professor Jhabwala's wife.
Okay.
And he was a very interesting man, and very strict disciplinarian. So normally you will find that people can get away with things. With him, no, because the year I joined, we had 3 people or 4 people kept over from the previous year for 1 attendance short.
Yes.
1. Okay. They were merciless. Okay. Now, let's start to look at it. I've talked to you about architects. Let's start to look at engineering. Our first 2 years of engineering, we had professors from IIT. I'm telling you, it was relentless because those guys were thinking and putting you at par with the IIT students, which was not really, fair, so to speak. For art, we had 3 masters of modern art. We had Tayyab Mehta, Krishan Khanna, and Biren De. Okay. All 3, if you will go on a search, you will find these 3 are masters in modern art.
Of course.
And they made you sort of, work in those workshops or in the art classes, very much like they would do in art school. So here is an IIT guy saying that I need this guy to work like an engineering student, the architect, of course, the artist, of course. And then we had these 2 people. One of them was a Dr. Charles Fabry. I don't know how these names stay with you. He was from the French consulate. He taught us history of architecture. The most amazing person. I've never seen so many slides, and a person who could make that subject. It could be quite dreary, and who could make that subject so interesting that you would look forward to his class. We were very, very shocked when we were told that a couple of years down the line, he had shot himself, killed himself. Wow. But anyway, that's the memory. And finally, my thesis guy. His name is Bruno de Souza. He was a compatriot of Charles Correa's from Michigan, and came down to Delhi. He's right now in Goa. He's an old man, still alive.
Are you in touch with him?
And he's not in touch right now with things. Yeah, he's in his 90s, but I found it was so fascinating working with somebody. He would never comment on what you were doing, never. He would simply say, in Israel, this is how they would approach it. Something happened here, and he would go away. So, instead of giving you that critique, that this should be this, so on. But actually, and it was with him, it was mainly sketching. He couldn't care a damn about your presentation and how good your inking was or how good your stenciling was. He was simply looking at the sketches and the concepts and so on. So see, these are some of the things that stay with you, which you think are vital, right? Okay.
Arjun, I believe you were in in the company of Stephen Hall while you were at Columbia. Is that true?
That was the last semester. A lot came before that. It was.
I'm sure. You also worked, just to kind of recap a little bit, you finished Rachna Sansad, you worked with Mr. Malik at Malik Architecture for 2 years, and then you went to Columbia for your master's, right?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your experiences there.
It was too soon. I think coming out of Rachna, where, as I already mentioned, I wasn't fully immersed in the implications of the profession, and getting out of there and then working with Dad, which obviously the practice had its definitions and its focus.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you finish your undergrad, you go for it's kind of a ritual path, right? Why Columbia? One is I had an affinity for the East Coast. The second was, Bernard Shumi. Shumi was to Columbia what maybe in a sense Alvin Boyarsky was to the AA. So I researched the programs very carefully. At the time, there were very few, single year or 3-semester programs. I think there was something at SIOC. Europe had a few of them, and then there was Columbia. So Columbia happened again. Besides the Shumi connection and researching some of the work coming out of it, I didn't know too much about it. Nor had I ever lived in boarding school. I'd never lived outside of home on my own, never had to fend for myself. So it was kind of a radical, it was a culture shock, to say the least, when I got there. I mean, right at the orientation program, they warned us saying that, look, we're going to bombard you with so much information. You're not going to have time to breathe or eat or sleep. Please assume that you will not process more than 5 to 7% of the information that you're being subjected to. It will take years, perhaps decades, and perhaps never to take root, right? So that's how you pretty much got started. Besides the program, and we're very, very fortunate to be surrounded by, I think you always think that the best pedagogues are going to be the practicing architect, but I think it was maybe Yehuda Safran in my second semester, Mark Rakitansky in my first, right? These are the guys who really forced you to open up, right? And think laterally there was no architecture being taught, I can tell you that. This was simply a way to perhaps expand thinking, expand consciousness, look as laterally as possible at the world around you, engage with art, engage with cinema, engage with literature, right? With no fixed end. It was just, so also the kind of people that you interacted with in terms of students from, different parts of the world, very different age groups, because in India, you'd always be, dealing with people maybe from a different background, a different ethnic background, or a slightly different cultural background, but you have the same age group, you're kind of in a similar place in life. Here, at the age of 25, I was perhaps the youngest student in that program. There was, people from 25 right up to 42 who were in the program. And coming in, I found largely from, South America, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. There were very few Americans in our program, at least for the first 2 semesters, after which you kind of joined up with the third-year MR program, where there were, more Americans there. So you were exposed to different kinds of thinking and different kinds of living, and a new city, and again, kind of an analog to Bombay, similar in its energy, but different in so many ways. So it wasn't just about the program. Obviously, when you got into your crit reviews and you saw the people who were walking around the campus, and Columbia, the city campus, right? It's perhaps one of the nicest city campuses you'd ever encounter, because it is a campus in the middle of the city. It's not one of the sprawling suburban campuses. The city is your playground. You step out onto Broadway and you have these amazing, cultural institutions. You have these beautiful video libraries. You have parks, etc. So it was a very different environment. Obviously, being mentored and being able to work side by side with people like Stephen Hall, amongst others. I mean, if you look at the 15 studios and the studio guide for the final spring semester, when you had to actually travel outside the United States to your sites, you look as a student coming from a different country, especially at the age I was at, there is simply no way to be anchored and objective in the face of all of that power, right? You
Yeah.
cannot be sitting in a room with Stephen and Yehuda and Eisenman and Leapskin and expect to be, having it's not possible. Okay, maybe there are people who are mature enough to do it, but generally these things, they throw you, they throw you into a bit of a spiral, right? So obviously you go there and then you come out of there and you're basically just spinning around. And there were a lot of things that happened even after school before I came home, including, our spring semester trip where we traveled to Prague. Our project was the Kafka Centrum.
The Kafka Center, yeah.
The Kafka Centrum, yeah. And, we went there and Stephen came with us. And since it was very close to spring break, all of us planned that you do the holy Eastern European triangle. You go from Prague, you do Vienna, you do Budapest. And a series of absolutely absurd events caused me to separate from the group, run off in a different direction, run out of money, get put into a border control cell, start selling things to be able to get back to the airport to get home. And the most important event, which is I met my future wife on that trip, which, Stephen knows. I wrote to him about it a couple of years later, thanking him, saying without him, I wouldn't in many, many ways be, where I currently am in life. So it wasn't just school. It was everything that was attendant to being exposed to the world, without the traditionally imposed filters.
I have to say that something that I believe in very, very dearly is that everybody needs to get out of their homes and live on their own at some point in their lives. And I think that completely changes you and gives you perspective on so many things. And like you said, right, sometimes it's a rude shock. Sometimes you kind of ease into it. But it's a sense of discovery. And these are the kind of experiences that end up shaping you, whether it's interacting with people or whether it's, selling stuff to find your way back home. So it's interesting to note that these are the kind of experiences and journeys that one goes through in order to actually shape who you become and how you end up working and what your value systems finally get established as. I did want to point out, is that the third generation of Maliks that we saw in the background a while back?
That was Gautam. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's
I
kind
wish
of
I could pull up one or two of his drawings. His
incredible drawings.
It's
incredible.
Actually quite, shocking. Maybe when Dad's speaking, I'll go and get one out.
It might be a little too early to ask, but do you think he's going to be the next generation in Malik architecture?
Or
does he feel that? Or you hope not?
I hope not. I think, hope not is perhaps the wrong way of putting it. I think just the same way that, Dad never kind of indoctrinated me, right? I'm making it a point not to do the same to him. But in hindsight, and having been through it once, I think in the process of being so open and not wanting to sway me in any way, right? Perhaps he also held back on certain things that would have mattered so much in hindsight. So I'm kind of thinking more now in terms of balance is how much, what do I share with him and what do I, keep away in
withhold,
withhold, so as not to push him in a particular direction. I suppose parenting is a totally different situation now.
Well, I'm sure like earlier, Mr. Malik, you were the only architect in the family. So you didn't have too many people to talk shop at home. But now do both of you discuss work when you're back?
No. We're see,
good.
I'll tell you. We both have a life. Okay?
That's great
other
to
than
hear coming
architecture.
from an architect.
Okay, other than architecture. I played squash for almost 4 decades. And if I could, I would go back on the court for, a couple of, games every now and then. But it's because, and all of them, he plays soccer. He would, see, the whole idea is physical fitness. Right. So we have that, as a key thing. You will find all the family members are doing something or the other. So that aspect is kept alive. So you have, so that is one aspect of it, which is physical fitness. I think that's vital now. That's number one. Number two is that you become a very boring person when all the time you're discussing architecture. I think I was once doing an interview for, with an architect for our office. And I asked this girl, that, have you read Hemingway? Well, what has that got to do with architecture? I said nothing and everything, because this ability to think laterally and not be not to have this tunnel vision, right, makes you also boring. I think these are some of the things that we basically feel that life should be rounded off, and then when you come home, there is no need to carry on the same dialogue that you had in the office, and even in the office, it's not necessary to keep on all the time with the with discussions. So I think we try and give each other space, and since, of course, it will come later. I'm sure you're going to ask those questions as to how you work. I'm sure it will surface later on. Yeah.
So we do talk a lot about architecture nowadays at home, because this is essentially become our active workspace. But otherwise, we talk about a lot of things, not always architecture. I think what he did mention perhaps is the services background, right, and the discipline that comes with that. So I think we were always raised with a sense of a balanced life, whether it be our activity, whether it be our academic, sports, food. It was balanced. So fortunately, from a very young age, I've pretty much been playing competitive sports since the age of 7. Right? It's
and
kept me
you're
out
playing
of,
with the league now, right?
I haven't been playing for the last 2 years. I still train with the team, but I think playing at that level competitively is a little bit beyond me. You can sustain it for a while, and then you're going to end up at the physios. Like, I've been spending enough time there. I really like my physio, but I don't want to go there too often. But I think I can't speak for him, but I just played team sports, right? Basketball and football competitively, extensively. And I found that, look, when you talk about people, you interact with people in very, very different circumstances, right? These are their own highly complex, highly organic, self-organizing sports, right?
Yes.
You learn a lot about the character of a person when you're involved in these situations with them. When people talk about meditation or the state of no mind, from my perspective, nothing exemplifies it like sport. You're 100% right there. And more importantly, when we talk about reflexive, or protagonistic or intuitive thinking, I think sport takes care. It really teaches you how to do that, because so many things, very much like our profession, that you can either deconstruct, iteratively and say that, first this happens and then that and that and that. But the point is the ability to make that quantum leap and execute those seamlessly without even thinking about them. I think you learn a lot from things that are not pure kind of, knowledge banks. You don't have to be worried about taking things away, but as you look back on certain activities and certain moments in your life, you start to understand that there is something far deeper that they have, kind of imprinted within you. In a sense, this is very, in fact, when you talk about sport and you talk about school, this is a very important lesson that I learned at Columbia, because my second-year studio with Yehuda Safran, who, by the way, also works very closely with Stephen Hole and Johanny Belasma, right? For our midterm review, he brought in Sanford Quinter as one of the visiting critics. I don't know if you know Sanford Quinter. He's absurdly intelligent, absurdly strange person, and in many ways a slightly frightening person as well, right? So obviously, there was Quinter and there was Eisenman coming in for the same review. So you could imagine all the horror stories we heard, and we were all a little bit more than nervous, right? Because I've personally seen, models being burnt and some pretty traumatic scars being inflicted on people in reviews. Anyway, that's a different situation. But I did read a bit about Quinter, and he has written a wonderful essay about Rem Koolhaas, right? And he, if you guys can find it, I'm sure it's available. It's called Flying the Bullet, where he basically equated Rem's thinking, right? Lateral thinking, intuitive thinking, to a World War II fighter pilot, Chuck Yeager, right? Okay. Because in World War II, You didn't have, laser guided missile systems. War wasn't a video game. You couldn't sit remotely and point a finger and, bomb the hell out of someone. There was the art of dogfighting at the time. And everyone was flying planes with more or less the same capability. There were no great technical advancements which one had and the other didn't. So everything about dogfighting, which was an immense skill at the time, essentially became about who could push the envelope, which means to intimately understand the functioning of the machine and to understand the functioning of the environment, whether it be wind speeds or turning radius or whatever. It was all about the ability to push the envelope that step further and to think quickly on your feet and intuitively. And he wove that narrative into REMS thinking and the genesis of OMA in a sense so beautifully. And then it was after that he came in for our review. So it just kind of sends you off, down so many different what you would imagine to be divergent streams. But it's all a way, a matter of how you see it, that you kind of start to see the connections or the convergence of the unity of it all.
No, completely. I have to interrupt you and I have to tell you that we've got a couple of your fans on Instagram. We've got Malcolm who's testifying to you being an excellent midfielder, and Andrew agrees. So we're going to have to see some of your handiwork at some point, I guess. But I want to come back to something that you said.
You're being very kind.
You said something, and this kind of resonates with what Mr. Malik has said in past conversations, where you don't have to give up one thing to do something else. And this earlier, Mr. Malik, you had mentioned this with respect to some of your meditation. And interestingly, I had actually gotten in touch with you about close to 5.5 years ago when we were launching the magazine Mondo Arc India. And as the editor, I called you up and I said, we want you to be a part of our panel when we launch the magazine. But before that, I requested you to write an article. And that particular article, we were talking about light, and I was very keen to explore the idea of natural light versus intended light. And we had this really beautiful conversation. And I'm going to quote from something that you had written, saying, "Sitting at Padmanasana on the deck of my residence, my gaze focuses on the first ray of the sun as it rises from behind the hill. This single ray becomes the object of my concentration and has literally become a guiding light for me in meditation." And this is something that was, that was a thread that we pulled on to create this article that you wrote and we titled it Chasing Ra. But what was very intriguing for me at that point was your practice of meditation and how you started to talk about this as being something that was intrinsic to your practice of your life and your living and also your architecture. So if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
You see, without getting into the esoteric, there are 112 known methods of meditation in this country. It's unbelievable. But what is meditation, right? It's because there's a lot of mumbo jumbo around it. First is that you have, if you look at it very simply, you have two things, subject and object. You're looking at something, it's an object. Subject and the third thing that comes in, for example, you look at thoughts. You can make out one thought is going, another one is coming. Who is watching these thoughts? So the common thread in all 112 methods is simple one word called witnessing. That's all it is. Witness, that's all. There is no mumbo jumbo to this. Now, when you witness, what happens? You become like a mirror. Something comes in front of you. It holds that reflection for a point, but there is no memory of it. It's gone. Right? So that's one aspect of it. Right? The other thing that it starts to now bind you closer and closer with nature. And as it begins to move deeper, and it does so on its own, I will not get into more details of it. You see, let me veer off in a slightly different direction for a moment. You know what we call the four eyes. I would sometimes talk to students on the four eyes. Intellect is the first one. Something which we have picked up from the time we are born, through parents, through teachers, through whatever, through media, all borrowed, right? Then we come to intuition. Instinct. I'm sorry, instinct. Now, this is something we have condemned to the dungeons because we've added a prefix to it. The moment we say instinct, we say animal, right? Now, this is something which has come through, evolved through millions of years, right? It's an intrinsic part of you, right? To understand. The third one is intelligence. When you start to become quiet, that's where intelligence starts to rise. And the fourth one is intuition. I think that is where there is a possibility of creativity. So actually, there is a tremendous sense of logic to this whole thing. I'm not for one moment trying to connect architecture with any of this, because I think life is far more important, this journey, than architecture finally.
So you've mentioned this tale where you were in the hills and you came upon the door of a sage and you had an interesting conversation with him. I request you to share that.
See, it's like this. There are two fundamental questions a sage will ask you. One, that leave all your baggage behind, because we always carry baggage. Most of it is the past. In a way, this has helped me through the profession also, where I go from site to site, and often people would tell me that you have no style. You've gone to Kerala, you're doing something, you're in Himachal, you're doing something, you're in Rajasthan, you're doing something. What is this? So in a way, don't carry baggage. You simply go there and you respond to a set of circumstances, a situation. So the essence really of this journey is, it's a centripetal journey. You go out, it's centrifugal. You go in, it's centripetal. But they are both journeys, and especially in the East, I think the two together are considered what they call samyama, or balance. That if you want a balance in life, you need to be, both outside and inside. You have to have a balance between them. So as far as I'm concerned, it is only that balance that one seeks.
So Arjun, when you came back from Colombia, I mean, these are some really sort of established values that Mr. Malik has been working with and has imbibed in the practice, right? So once you had a different journey, of course. You've had your own personal journey. You go to Colombia, you're in the thick of this loud, boisterous city, and then you come back and you join the practice. And this practice that has been running for 30 years, and this is something that I had actually asked both of you. So let's say, Arjun, what was your initial reaction? Like, were you able to assimilate this idea of having a very, sort of a silent approach to architecture, or was that a little bit of a challenge for you?
So growing up at home, there were plenty of books. I think the one I remember most was, Paramahansa Yogananda. I think there was Man's Eternal Quest and Autobiography of a Yogi. So I suppose we read them. How much one could even relate to that at that age is questionable.
Yeah.
Once again, I think that there were certain fixed points of reference that one had deep within without even knowing it. Whether it was some of those influences, some of the reading, the general, I would say graceful and composed background of the family, the sea next door, and then there was this so-called disruption, right? Very important disruption that took place. So I came back from Colombia, and as I mentioned, there was, at least in my particular case, I don't think the anchors at that time were strong enough to ground me, right, in the midst of all that, influences. So I think the first few years coming back from Colombia were definitely less mediated, a little less imbalanced than what the practice was used to, certainly than what he speaks about. I think he could sense that, and I figured, he was just being a very, very graceful parent and mentor in terms of, if this is what it has to be, this is what it has to be. Certainly, the first 4 or 5 years, what came out of the practice, or at least the projects that I was involved in, I think it is quite obvious that there was a certain turbulence there. That on one hand, one was trying to reconcile more kind of, the thinking of the practice and his thinking in a sense, and then there were other, other forces pulling in a different direction. And it had to happen. It was part of the journey. It was very important in terms of what it led to after that. But I think the first feels was quite tumultuous. I think the first 4 or 5 years, it took that there was a little bit of separation, and one was able to view things in hindsight, and then learn from those and start, I think, stepping towards or moving towards more some of the core principles that define the practice, perhaps now over the last 5 or 6 years, and then I guess moving forward as well.
So I also wanted to ask Mr. Malik, did you feel that, now that Arjun's coming back and stepping back into the practice, did you think that, okay, there was a defined space for him, or were there, from your perspective, were there challenges, and was there friction?
Yeah, it's a valid question. I think I believe that the grace must come from the elder generation. And I think if you put the ego a little bit on the back burner, it is not difficult to muster or generate that grace. Also, you have to understand, I was there when he was doing it was a dissertation for the Kafka. I was in America, and they invited me, and I was sitting there in the front row along with those stalwarts there.
Okay.
And believe me, it was not only radical thinking. I mean, from the little I remember, but there was, and I'm very bad at names, but one of the gentlemen, architects, and you can imagine this can never happen in this country, he was talking to the other architect, and both well-known names, and saying that, well, if you were to do this project, will you still do those steel and glass buildings, or would you do something else? So he says, no, I'd do something else. He says, then what about that horrible building which you've done in New Jersey? Can you imagine? It shook me, that, can you imagine in our countries that somebody would do something like that? But that was one aspect of it. The other is that when you send a person, there is a fair amount of radical stuff being thrown at you. And the person needs to have some elbow room for expression. I would certainly come in to guide, but in all fairness, some of this expression, which actually took us into a higher level of technology, has been incorporated in future projects. So for me, it is not only this that, there was an aberration. No, I don't think we should use that word. I think the graph somewhere moved, but some of those principles and some of those, I would say, objectives that we were trying to do, they actually helped us considerably when we started to do future projects. For example, we did, I think, one of the most technologically advanced steel buildings. And we learned terrible lessons. One, that we don't have good engineers. And if you are wanting to do things, now, for example, we wanted a column-free space of 16 meters, okay? And we were giving 300 thick beam and so on. And then, well, there were a whole lot of issues. I can tell you twice, we hired British engineers to do this. Twice they were proved wrong and they had to redo their calculations and strengthen the building. Can you imagine? Twice. So it was a great learning curve. And I think that is also important.
I'm sure, yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've just lost our feed on Instagram. So yeah, I've just gone live again. Can you see me?
Okay.
Live? No?
1 second, I'm going to stop sharing. So go live.
Okay, I'll try again.
I think it's sent
Just
me live. I don't think I'm on your. Hang on 1 second.
Just go to your homepage.
Okay, hang on. I have you there. I got you.
Just a second.
It's saying it's live.
I'm now live and I am going to just invite you.
Trouble with loading this live video. Fantastic.
Okay. I don't see you on Instagram, so.
1 second.
Yeah.
Try again. Yeah. I can see there are two Ghadioks. There's one live and one who's not live.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I'm partly live and partly dead.
Let me just get out and do it again. It's more than we're in episode.
I was just getting into my conversation about paradoxes after this. Great.
Yeah. Wait, let me try the other one then. Okay, now I'm going to be one who is not live.
I'm just going live now. Hi, we're back. Sorry, we lost the feed on Instagram. We're just trying to get back.
Got you.
Yeah, I don't see you.
Yeah, you're there. Yeah.
Okay. There you go.
I just sent you a request.
Yes. Waiting for you to accept it.
Should be there.
Oh, there we are, and we're back. Sorry about that. Sorry. Mr. Malik, do you want to just kind of quickly recap for our audience on Instagram your last response? Sorry, there was a lot that you shared with us.
I think your question was that when Arjun returned and
whether you found any challenges or whether there was any apparent friction.
There is obviously a somebody who is sort of coming in with new ideas, and I think what I said was that as the elder generation, I thought that I should show the grace of allowing this young man to be able to express himself. And I think those projects can be, I think they were, I would say they were very good projects. And more importantly, they actually gave us a direction in terms of incorporating better technology into our work. Because from whatever I had been doing, there was a certain sort of, there were certain parameters. But here we were able to and then our recent works have actually used some of that material which we were able to discover, generate, in these projects.
It's actually a strange situation. I believe every practice perhaps goes through the same process of self-reflection. That right from that time, I think it was about 2006. I graduated in 2005. I came back in 2005 end. So I would say 2006 to about 2010 is the period that we're talking about, right? But if you look at what happened then and then what happened subsequently, you can actually sense this journey, that if that hadn't happened, that wouldn't have happened. You can see the kind of the river meandering, and it would be nice somewhere out, to be able to draw that out with a graph and understand, because when you look back on these things, you can actually, you think that it's something coming out of ether, but then you look back and you just at the right moment, you realize it's come from somewhere else, right? Maybe there's nothing new. I don't think there's anything new. Something is borrowed from somewhere or the other, whether it's overt and it's within your your overt consciousness, or it's deeply submerged somewhere. So I think what happened there was linked to something before, and what came after got linked to something over there. And it's just it's an interesting process to deconstruct, to just reflect upon.
So are there any specific milestones or projects that you can recall that bear evidence to this? Or any seminal work where you felt that things at this point were changing, or that was a particular moment that was important?
Okay. So I think maybe coming back with a slightly more theoretical mindset, kind of caused me to look back at the work of the practice. And I've been doing that now for the last 15 years, right? Moving forward, looking back, moving forward, looking back. I think for me, what stood out was you talked about one of the first edition of Mondo when you guys launched, and the Lupin headquarters in Pune.
Right.
I think that for me stood out as a moment in time where a lot of thinking, both technical, scientific, spiritual, humanistic, kind of coalesced into a wonderful moment, right? In that, I could see traces of that in a cancer center in Rajasthan. So whatever we say now in terms of when we talk about, maybe the language has become a little bit more articulate. Maybe we've begun to frame certain ideas better, but I think the seeds of it, or the intent or the essence of it, has actually been, it's existed for a very long time.
But has the process evolved over time?
Perhaps at a time when it has to. Of course it has. It's, it's, I don't know. I think in a sense, look, I think both in terms of our temperaments, we both have a very strong affinity towards water, not just for its physicality or its reflection, but for the kind of sense of silence and metaphor that it brings to us personally and to our lives. And, if you were to equate us to water, he would be the still depths of a well, and I would kind of be more of its, palpitating, turbulent surface. Now, essentially, they are two states of the same being, and they converge and they diverge, right? So in terms of the process, I think things have perhaps been articulated more, right? Core ideas have remained constant, they've evolved. There is no revolution here, it's always been evolution. But I think the idea of reading into a situation, and I think it's very important that you have two people, I think a network of people outside of these two, who are in a position to be able to frame a network of thought or seeing, because that's really fundamental to the process. Otherwise, you could be looking at something precious and important, and it will just pass you by if you're not receptive to that process. So I think we've just become a little bit more mindful of really trying to be silent, what I would call silence, what he would call perhaps letting the baggage go, of starting to understand situations in order to be able to cut through the nonsense of the noise and start to really distill down to what is the essence of the situation, to understand that single point beyond which you cannot abbreviate a situation, because you can't abbreviate reality, right? And I believe this applies to not just all these subjective realities around. I think it applies to every great work of art or literature or cinema. You can't compress Dostoevsky's work into a 1,000-word summary. Unfortunately, which is, I think we're being forced to do it sometimes. But I think in that sense, the process has evolved, but at its core, it hasn't fundamentally changed.
So this is something that I read over and over again, where your practice is kind of pivoted on the idea of the ecology and spirit, right? What's also interesting is to see that a lot of your works, and this is something, Mr. Malik, you mentioned a little earlier in this conversation, is that when people talk to you about your style, and there's not necessarily a particular kind of style that you're working with. But what I find intriguing is that even though your product, and by product over here, I mean the building, might look very different, might be stylized very differently from the other. But the process, and this is something that you have repeatedly mentioned before, is still sitting in those values of the spirit and ecology. And I'm intrigued to know, and I wanted to ask, is that when you talk about spirit over here, right? Spirit could mean multiple things. And what is it that you're referencing to exactly? Are you talking about a spiritual practice of being, of yourselves as individuals, as architects? Does this also perhaps sort of get interpreted as the zeitgeist, or what Christopher Alexander, famously has called the value or the quality without a name? So what is it that you look for, or what is it that you're seeking when you're working on a project with respect to spirit?
You see, one of the most fundamental issues is light. Okay. I don't know if there was a conference going on, and the two and speaking very that man needed shelter, so he kind of created the wall, and then after some time he found he had lost the forest, so he started to make cuts in the wall, and the column was born, and so on. And therefore man's greatest invention is the wall. And Louis Kahn, hand up, said, I don't agree. And what don't you agree with, Mr. Kahn? He says, I think the most important thing is light, because without light, the wall could not see itself. So this is a very important aspect. It also gives the project, the work, a sense of movement. Well, after all, everything that you do is fundamentally static. How do you, so you can go and, you can go to, let's say, a house and see in the courtyard and say, this should be around 2:30 in the afternoon, right? And see how the sun is moving, how you're responding to nature, of course, how you're responding to local materials, how are you using the local craftsmen. And see, there are a whole lot of prefixes that we have put together, and we must go through that process. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 before we, and I also tend never to draw a line till this is sorted out in the head, because the moment you draw a line, you start committing yourself. I mean, I feel this way. This is my way of thinking. So no lines. We are in Lonavala, where we done our house. you have a hill on the south, you've got a lake up on the north, on the east, you've got a fort, you've got a forest all around you. There are so many things that you need to absorb. And so how are you going to that site? You're going to that site actually not as a great designer, but you're going there with some humility, with a small prayer to nature that, will you guide me in what I should do here? Because, so I think if you look at it, that's the way in the East people have been working. And therefore, you also work, when I talked about witnessing, it goes to the other one, to the other extreme, where you also become a catalyst, which all these elements are already there with you, and you become a catalyst, and you're putting them together. But they are now speaking to you. So I think there is this particular way of looking at things.
Arjun, do you feel the same? Do you respond to the site and to briefs in a similar manner?
I'm guessing by now you would have realized that every time you ask a question, you're gonna get the answer is gonna go off at a tangent. Look, I think the whole idea of architecture as a synthesis of ecology and spirit happened in the few months or the first couple of years after I came back. Now, again, you come back, you look at things from the outside. On the one hand, you have very intimate knowledge of the internal processes, right? On the other hand, you're coming from a totally different place. And those two words, ecology and spirit, are so open-ended, right? But the reason we chose these words also links back to a very odd conversation I had back in Colombia with Yehuda Safran. For those who aren't familiar with him, I think he's into his 70s now. I have never met, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have never met anyone who is such a vast repository of knowledge, to the extent that we had a $5 challenge in our studio. That if someone can ask a question that Yehuda can't answer, they win $5. Right? This guy was the former professor of the Royal College of the Arts in London. He was, I don't know where and how he got into architecture, but the guy was just insanely smart, right? Now, I was at the time doing a course in situationist mapping with Ed Keller, right? And Ed was a bit of a radical thinker. And after a couple of the discussions, he directed me towards the writings of Terence McKenna. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but this guy was part of the, shall we say, the intellectual hippie movement that tended to look at, substances as a doorway to something different, right? And I started to read about Terence McKenna, and it's really weird. It was very unsettling for me because I found a lot of what he was saying was resonating very closely with what I'd read in Yogananda's books. And there was obviously a sense of, what on earth is going on over here, right? And so I went to Yehuda with this, right? And I told him that, Ed talked to me about Terence McKenna and, Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy. And this guy just cuts through all the bullshit really easily. He's incredible in that way. The first thing he says, well, I'm going to have a chat with Ed about, what he's telling his students to read, right? And I asked him that, have you read Terence McKenna? And he said, no. And I said, first of all, okay, there's my $5, number one. Second, I said, how do you possibly comment on, if you haven't read him? And he had basically just read two of the lines that I pulled out from it. And he just sat back, crossed his arms, and he told me, you don't need to drink an entire barrel of wine to know what it tastes like, right? So I think this little encounters that when we came back, we also got into the idea that we don't need to confine ourselves. We don't need to look at narrow definitions. And we do look at ecology and spirit as a very broad spectrum, which could include anything from the physical to nature to humans to society to culture. It could, involve everything. And I think when he talked about, life, or he talks about a site and look, I think, again, it's about having the silence to be able to occupy a position of humility, right? and to be able to be quiet and frame the question from the situation without overloading the situation with abstract content, abstract concepts. Right? And it again comes back to the fact that on one hand, contemporary architecture or contemporary practice almost forces you to articulate a position or to situate yourself, right? And I don't really know if that's an appropriate position to allow yourself, which is what we fight for hardest, which is freedom, right? Which is the freedom to constantly discover and the freedom to be reborn and the freedom to transform. So you're constantly in this position where you're, and that's why we talk about balance or equilibrium. It's the foundation of everything that we do. It sits at the center, and then things kind of as a matrix revolve around them. But to allow yourself the freedom, but not to get stuck in a whimsical position, as Mies famously said, you don't wake up to a new architecture every morning. So how do you stay grounded? How do you stay adaptable? I think these are questions that we deliberate, not always kind of overtly, but certainly within ourselves and within the, I suppose, the walls of our practice, so to speak. So yes, a site, each situation is deeply intimate and deeply specific, right? Obviously, the physicality of it, its topography, its environment, its climate, of looking to history and tradition of architecture without architects, not just to look at physical environments, but to look at everything that shaped those environments, right? To study those, to understand the whys, to synthesize them, to extrapolate new ideas, to use history really as a springboard, to project, right? For history to be instructive, not prescriptive, not limiting, because I've come across so many people, people who are far more experienced than me, right? And I find that it's very different having 20 years experience and having 1 year's experience 20 times. Right? So you have to understand when things start to become limiting, when things start to become baggage, and that is the danger of experience and fixed positions.
Actually, since you're talking about history, there was an interesting sort of story that you shared with me many years ago about this temple at the Pavna Lake, if I'm not mistaken. So, Mr. Malik, it would be great if you could share that with our audience, and then I think maybe we'll take a couple of questions after that.
Okay.
Just 1 second, sorry. Could you hear me, Mrinalini?
I can hear you.
You could hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, strange, because my headphone popped off. Weird. Are you hearing me clearly there?
Yeah.
Okay, it's fine. I can actually hear you through wherever it is. So as long as you can hear me when I speak, it's fine. Sorry.
Okay. I think we're okay with the sound. If anybody on Instagram is having any trouble with sound, just send us a message so that we know. But otherwise, I think we're okay with sound.
So the first thing that, because I go regularly to my house in Pavna, the first thing I did really was to enmesh myself with the village. So there is nobody from Mumbai who works there. I got the people from the village, trained them, and they have the key to the house. They manage everything. They also, in return, every time I go there is always something that we need something to be done, and so on and so forth. Now, I will just, I'll come to the temple, but recently, all around us are almost 1,800 acres of SR's floriculture, which is shut down because the company was not doing well, and close to 350 men and women from the village are without a job. So we've been looking at ways of how we can start to give employment to these people. Of course, I won't get into the details, but certainly so that you're able to mesh yourself better. Now, one came to me and said that there is a temple which is submerged in the lake for 8 months and only surfaces for 4 months. It's an old Shiva temple. So I was taken there. I'm neither a bhakt or whatever. So I simply went there. and perhaps he will share some images of it. It was most exquisite. Of course, I have seen it as it starts emerging. Water, it's almost like a mirage that starts to move.
Shall I share the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. And
Yeah. Sorry, for people on Instagram, unfortunately, we can't show you what is being shared, but this conversation is being recorded. So you can either shift to Zoom and join us on Zoom so you can see the screen that is being shared, or you can go on to YouTube as well. And if you can't do either of them, this conversation is being recorded and will be available on YouTube later as well. So just go onto YouTube, search for Unplugged Talks, and find this chat there.
yeah, I think you can see it.
Yes.
It's exquisite.
Oh, Siddhant, we've gone onto the matra screen. Are you being able to share? No, it's not broadcasting. Also, Arjun, I seem to have lost your voice on Zoom. I can hear you on Instagram, but I can't hear you on Zoom. It was fine till now. You've left the Zoom chat for some reason. You're not on Zoom at all anymore. Okay. So people on Zoom, we've lost the Maliks. Give us a second till they log back on. Till then, if you have any questions, please send them in. We've got a couple of questions that are coming in. We will take them as soon as we've seen what the Maliks want to share with us on the screen. It's a fascinating temple, which is literally in the middle of the lake in Pavna. And Vivek, you're saying it says it's an internal meeting only. Nope. Siddhant, I think we've got a couple of people who want to join the Zoom meeting and are not being let in. So if you can, please. And we will post the Zoom ID on Instagram once again. In case you can't find it on Instagram, just go to my handle and it's in my, all the links are in my bio. So you can connect from there. Okay, and you're back, Arjun.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Siddhant, can you just put the Zoom ID on Instagram? And now I've lost you on Instagram, Arjun.
Yeah, I can't see you on Instagram, so I'm just going to cancel that and
okay.
Send a request. I'm requesting you again. Hang on.
Okay, great. So we're just waiting for Arjun and Kamal to come back. Go live, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It says connecting.
Yep. Should be on in a second.
Okay, there we are. So we're back on both Zoom and Insta?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And you can hear me clearly? I can hear you.
Yes.
Excellent. And now we shall try sharing your screen.
And my phone is now going to die in about 5 minutes.
Oh no.
It gets more and more interesting.
In case you lose the Insta feed, please join us on Zoom or YouTube. The links are on my, they're all in my handle and my bio. Yeah.
Can you hear us without any echo? Or
I can. I'm getting a little bit of an echo more than what it was earlier.
Okay, because right now we're on, 1 second. Dad, can I get your little pod? We'll have to stay on this for a few minutes while I just recharge these back up, yeah?
Okay, sure. While technology helps us connect across seas, it also limits us and challenges us.
This is part of it. Should I try sharing my screen or shall we just stay safe and not go there?
No, please share your screen.
Okay, let me try. So 1 second. Screen, all right.
Guys, there is an echo on Instagram because we've had to take our earpods and charge them. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
My bad. Sorry, guys.
But no worries, no worries. Just like I said, come on to Zoom or come on to YouTube.
Can you see this?
Yes, we can.
So that was, I think, you talked about it being submerged, right?
Yeah, and then we've subsequently restored it last season, and I believe it's withstood the monsoons and the dunking under the lake very well.
Really?
Yeah.
So how many such cycles has it been through already now?
No, one right now.
One?
Yeah. But just look at it. It must have been a shallow river once upon a time. There's a little ghat in front.
Yeah.
And they would come in a boat, and as we've been excavating, we've been finding more and more. It's a whole story here.
Wow, this is fascinating.
Yeah, it's actually quite amazing when you, and we're very fortunate, Mrinalini, you know Parul. So she and Anil, the photographer, went down there in the blazing heat, and they spent a whole day documenting this place. There were lots of, because of the constant damage of it being submerged, for a long time, the stones were strewn all over the place. So we had to roam around quite far, pick up each stone, try and tag it, map it where it went, put it back on the ground, and then not kind of restore it, to its exact original form, but to kind of give it a more abstract sense of where it was. It's still in process. It's not done. There are a lot of pieces still lying around, and as we uncovered some of the plinths around it, we found that it wasn't a single temple. There were a couple of plinths. It almost felt like a micro kind of temple complex. So we don't know right now whether it's, sorry?
That's stunning.
Yeah. And
she must have been a priest and so on. See, there used to be, if this is Shiva temple, the Brahma and Vishnu were there, much smaller temples always. And then the priest's house. So really you would see. Just look at that.
And for how much time of the year is this? Does this
4
area
months.
get inundated?
Oh, 8 months. It's down. It's in the water.
Wow.
You see
it's
it
only
emerge.
visible for 4 months.
Yeah.
Jan to, so you can actually look. Unfortunately, we didn't do the time lapse, but you can actually see it coming up and then resubmerging.
Right.
So it starts in about Jan and Feb. I think it's completely out of the water, and then you got about 4 months where you can actually walk there. Otherwise, it's a complete lake bed.
Wow.
So this is it's something that we're continuing with. It's somewhere where we're exploring kind of outside the area of core practice, but this keeps us, going as well. Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff, which is interesting, right? There's a lot of stuff that's happening outside of your architectural practice. And this is something that I did want to touch upon is, besides just doing individual and independent work and project work, what is your ideology with respect to engaging with the public or engaging with the community? Do you have some sort of a set outreach or an intention, whether it's locally in Bombay or, you're sitting in the middle of Ballard Estate in Bombay, which is an interesting space as well. So do you, as individuals, as Bombayites or as architects, do you feel that compelling urge, or do you feel the need to engage with the community at any point?
Is this a leading question?
No.
It's not. Okay.
It could. Let's see where it goes.
Okay. So I think you're kind of aware of what's happening or what has been happening over the last year. And I think being citizens of Bombay and seeing its transformation over decades, right? And being fortunate enough to live in a place like Navy Nagar, which is kind of insulated from Bombay's, bustle and chaos, and then being able to work in a precinct like Ballard Estate, which, according to me, is perhaps one of the finest, if not the finest, heritage commercial districts, right? It's very different. I think Bombay's heritage areas are very different to Delhi's in terms of, being the seat of institutional power, and then, talking more about commerce and economics in Bombay. So, the precinct where all the former shipping offices are located, right on the waterfront, which is now the actual base from where the new waterfront development is starting. Look, we've been sitting there and watching. I don't think we've been particularly active in the public domain, right? But we've been watching good people, well-intentioned people and organizations giving of their time, of their energy, and of themselves. Whether it's, Brinda Samaya, or it's UDRI or Herbs. So many people have been talking about the Bombay Esplanade, talking about Bombay's, heritage conservation plans, Abha's, Narayan Lamba, Vikas Dilawari. And Ballad Estate has so many proposals. There's so much information out there about potentialities for the rehabilitation, the recovery of that kind of district into something that is more community driven, more vibrant, more mixed use, right? And we've seen people butting their heads against a wall. We saw Charles doing it for the last decade of his career, right? And we're a bit, frankly, I can't speak for him, but the bureaucracy terrifies me. I don't know if I have the stomach to deal with those kind of people. So as recently as a year back, I think in response to Bimal's, the waterfront proposal that came through and has, I think, temporarily been shelved, right? We figured, okay, now's the time. We need to do something. And I think the universe tends to align itself fortuitously, at certain times. Right next to us, there is a fully functioning ice factory, right? It's almost like a tiny urban block in Ballad Estate. It's a beautiful premises with its north-lit wooden truss roofs. The landlords have been producing both cube ice and block ice there, for a long time. It's a multi-generational business. It links back all the way to ice being brought in on ships from all over the world. Now, that business has been shrinking, and in a sense, there is already a start of an urban renewal in that small, a micro site where there's a lovely restaurant, clearing house. There is a children's playhouse. There is a small little exhibition space. Part of it is go downs. And we were, we got acquainted through a mutual friend, talking about that they want to shift their major block ice production out of Ballad Estate into Navi Mumbai. And so the space is becoming available. Now, this was the ideal opportunity to get together with a couple of friends and really start to imagine that, is there a tiny ecosystem, a tiny seed that we can plant in the space that can talk about, urban renewal, that can talk about an institution with democratic values, that can talk about the repurposing and the adaptation of heritage also to be economically sustainable, as perhaps the tiny seed that can allow us then to engage at a wider level, right, through activism or advocacy, saying that, look, it can work. It doesn't have to be, tabula rasa. It doesn't have to be demolition and all new. There are ways to synthesize, right, and to adapt to make history sustainable. And we've seen examples all over the world. There are precious few that we can find as living, working, functioning organisms in our immediate environment, right? And I think from there, it just kind of snowballed into a different kind of process. There have been so many dialogues. You've been part of them, Mrinalini, to a very, very large extent. And the process goes on. But I think we're determined to try and push this through, right? And it's become such an open-ended process. And we're trying to, limit our authorship of the project. We spoke about the idea of the catalyst. We're trying to limit our authorship. We're trying to look at an idea of an embedded critical commentary, within this place, and talking to people from diverse backgrounds and diverse disciplines to really bring in first physically a democratic institution, and then as an extension through the foundation, something which can then, inform future practices and future, look at collaborations with, institutions nationally and internationally coming to the future. So I think for us, our sense of giving back tends to happen as people within our own kind of, micro environment, but also taking up something like this, or talking about the temple, or doing some pro bono work with institutions on, on medical institutes or whatever. But I don't think it's a socially active practice in the traditional sense.
Sure.
But it does kind of explore it laterally in many, many ways. But I think, and this is a very important topic, I think a lot of weight and value is given to the moral provenance of a project, right? And I've debated this internally as well as with friends for a long time, that it doesn't matter what the project is, right? Because very often as architects, we are, in a sense, tools of capital. We are important in determining what happens in a particular place. For example, if someone approaches you with a plot of land and they're talking about it for their commercial premises or their office or their home, okay, we don't play a major part in the decision as to, whether it's going to be an office or a home, or it's going to be a hospital, or it's going to be a school, or it's going to be a community institution, right? What we can do from there on is chart a path or steer decision-making, right? To the extent where either we can overtly do it through a more benevolent patron, or subversively do it is to actually try and carve out public space or introduce a public dimension to a private program, right? We're focusing a lot of attention on that right now. I said sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes it's a little bit more kind of subversive, where there's a dual narrative in terms of what we're actually doing and what is being projected out there to the patron, right? But I think every situation, every context, every project has the potential to extract something beyond its physical dimensions, whether it be a questioning of the status quo, right? Or it be a public outreach or a community outreach. Right? I don't believe that a community center or a temple has more value from certain perspectives than a private project, because I think it's far more difficult to bring a social or public dimension to what is conservatively or conventionally a private domain than to be pushed into a community project and saying, okay, you've already been given the space, the moral provenance is already established. You don't have to fight for that.
Sure.
Right?
No, it's interesting that you bring this in, and this is something that we can talk for hours about, but I'm going to pull in a couple of questions. I know Viren has something that he wants to ask. So Viren, if you could just unmute yourself on Zoom.
Yeah, I've done that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
But before me, there's...
Instagram can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me. But Mrinalini, there's Rajat before me who has put a question. I think we should entertain first this question.
Sorry, who?
Rajat. You see, there is one architect, Rajat. Ma'am, please connect me.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm.
Maybe he has a question.
Yes, architect Rajat. You could unmute yourself. Sorry, I missed that message.
No problem. Is he still there? He seems to have left.
Okay.
There seems to be no. Yeah. Let me formulate a question. Yeah.
One second. Arjun, you disappeared from Instagram. Have you lost your battery?
Phone died.
Phone died.
Gone. I can't use yours, Dad. Sorry.
You can't charge
My
it.
phone's died. Bye, Insta. Sorry.
Okay, so what we're going to do is, unfortunately, I'm just going to terminate the Instagram feed and then ask people to shift in. So Viren, give me a second. For our friends on Instagram, I'm really sorry, but Arjun's battery has died on his phone. So we've lost their connection. I would request you to move on to Zoom or to YouTube. We are live on Zoom and YouTube. You can get all the information and the details and the links to connect to either of these two platforms from my account and from my bio on Instagram. I will stay live for a couple of minutes just so that you can transition. And then I'm going to be terminating the feed on Instagram. So please join us on Zoom or YouTube. Yeah, sorry about that. But we will go ahead with Viren's question.
Yeah. You can hear me? Arjun, Kamal?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for letting us peep into your world. But I want that we can peep a little more. So therefore, these questions. There are three questions that I have, three different areas. Maybe while questioning, there would be a fourth that will emerge. Let me see. I will start from the last one. And that has to do with, do you see presently, and I think that that this question almost is compulsory, because of the COVID right now, the lockdown, and subsequently the migration of a good population out of our cities. Nearly all cities have experienced the migration of labor, migration of our support system in the industry, in the construction industry. I certainly don't want to tread there onto something that is controversial, but I see there a possibility of upgrading and improving the infrastructure of our cities. And do you see there, because Kamal, you have been 40 years into practice and you're 40 years into knowing the turf. And I can understand Arjun not wanting to get into the bureaucracy, which I also try to avoid, I must tell you honestly, which is a tough turf. But I'm very sure you have dealt with many bureaucrats, even working on the ice factory. Do you see, so my first question is, do you see there a possibility and a certain benevolency that can emerge right now or is emerging towards a large population which is unfortunately living? I'm not saying the organic architecture is not fascinating. I find it all very fascinating. But does one foresee a certain upgradation of it on the part of hygiene, on part of creating a better livelihood? Are these things being debated now in certain circles? And is there any chance that this will be picking up more in the future? That's one question. Yeah. Then shall I add the other question, or you would like to answer right now?
I think let's do this one.
Okay, please. Come
on. I think COVID is going to change our lives radically for a long time to come. One is, as you rightly said, the exodus of the migrants from the major cities. The exodus continues. It is only being limited by the number of trains that they could run and the number of tickets that people could get. Otherwise, everybody is waiting in line to move, Certainly, it is going to throw up one major issue of support staff and also of any kind of skilled labor, whether it's the construction industry or you're running a small factory or whatever you're doing. The problems are going to be manifest. And one is frankly not even, one doesn't know the answer to it, right? As far as an opportunity is concerned, everywhere, two sides to the coin. One side is pretty bleak, and we've seen that, and distressing, coupled with the impact on the economy and so on. The other is it gives you an opportunity to be able to start to, I won't say replan your cities, but at least try and give an opportunity for these cities to be able to breathe again. Because they're completely stifled and choked from all points of view. And I think I must correct you when you said that I have in my time met lots of bureaucrats, etc. You will find that I've met nobody, right? But anyway, I was just trying to clear the air completely there. Nobody, right?
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. So I think there is an opportunity there. Obviously, dependent on the politicians and the powers to be, right? So I think there is a possibility where we can actually use this to be able to replan. I'm not for one moment giving solutions because solutions are complex, right? But the possibility exists. For example, you take Kaf Parade. How do you think these settlements happened? I won't use the word slum. I use the word settlement. There was construction of Kaf Parade. The workers came. Now, anywhere in the world, when you bring in
a crew to construct. When you finish the construction, they go away. These guys stay. And once they stay there, they also become great vote banks. So that's how all of them have been created. And the answer for high FSIs and high TDR is not it. I think you need to relook at this with some amount of, I would say, sensitivity, right? Rather than simply looking at numbers and logistics.
Viren, sorry, I need to jump in on this one.
Please.
Look, I think the inequitable living conditions of people in this country has been a source of distress and debate for ages now. Okay, there have been arguments for and against densification, centralization, more cities, more peri-urban or rural development. There are many cases on both sides, right? What we're seeing right now, besides the current economic distress and the humanitarian crisis that we're facing, I think there's a massive existential crisis at many levels, right? I think the entire question of cities and how many of our architectural studies, debate in schools, debate across the profession has centered on cities and living conditions in cities and the future of cities, right? What happens to cities now? I mean, what happens to the very idea of cities and of such a heavy concentration of people that will not be able to withstand natural disasters or pandemics? And on one hand, we are pushing technology into space, and on the other hand, we're densifying into closer and closer and tighter knit environments. I don't understand. They seem to be two paradoxical, streams, right? We've realized now through this that you can stay connected in so many different ways. Packing people together in tight spaces is a disaster that's just waiting to happen, and we've seen it, right? The other part with regards to, of labor and of skill and of construction, Viren, even through our practice, and I think there are so many, practices in the country, and a major discourse in this country is about the fact that we are not yet fully industrialized like other developed countries. A lot of our access to human resource, our access to craft, and the available craft and resource in this country far exceeds anything in the developed nations, and therefore there has been a certain bias towards working by hand, right? And working by hand because there is a certain economy to it. There is also a certain dignity to it, and we're talking about rehabilitating, dying arts or dying crafts or dying skills. Right? We all talk about the fact that why on earth should an expert, mason or someone who has an immense skill in carving be sitting there and hammering away at, formworks for concrete. We debated this, right? But now we need to understand that on one hand, we're seeing labor shifting out of cities. We have focused our attention on human resource-based systems. And now we're suddenly being pulled in the opposite direction where you're saying to be sustainable, you need to reduce your dependence on human resource. So we're sitting in so many catch-22 situations right now, right? That I think there are, I hope people smarter than at least me who are, debating some of this and coming up with constructive solutions, because I'm not really seeing them right now.
Thank you. Can I put the second question across? Is there some other question, Mrinalini?
Yes, we've got somebody else who also wants to ask a question. But why don't you finish yours and then we can...
Yeah, I'll finish mine. Yeah.
Sure.
I've experienced some of your masterpieces across the country. I've visited, not so many, but 3 of them. And I always felt they're extremely well crafted, well detailed, very tight in their production and in their expression. So I can imagine you would be having a lot of challenges in working with a client, trying to get the client, because knowing Indian conditions where clients are very, very much a part of the design. I mean, I face that regularly, especially when it comes to residential architecture. And I mean residential architecture in this case, especially because I've seen mostly your residential work. Now, on one hand, you have this client, and you are the creative designer, both of you. And what is very interesting, I should add it for the audience. I have experienced that. You have such good friendship with your client. You establish actually a wonderful relationship. I remember also, I should share that here, the South Extension house that you did. The first time I met you at the site, the next thing was that I was invited for a lunch, a revel. And to my surprise, it was a wonderful, memorable experience. I give that to most of other friends and sometimes clients also, how one can behave and be so friendly with their architects. And it brings me but to this question. If on one hand, your architecture is so tight, how do you see the possibility beyond the constructed object, a interface between, or do you build it, is it desirable, a interface between the client and the building that the client gets? And to that is the link. What is your feedback from the client once they shift and use the buildings? And do they sense a transformation of their being, of living in the buildings that you create for them? So these, I feel, are linked to the other. One is the friendship that you develop and evolve with your client, which is wonderful, the craftsmanship and tightness, and then the feedback, and then the transformation.
So when you talked about South Extension, the lady in question, Manali, she called me, strangely, not more than a fortnight ago, to say that, Kamal, we've been in this lockdown situation for over 2 months. You have given us a beautiful house. I can move different parts of that house, and it's a wonderful experience for me. I don't get bored. I'm able to, So this is one aspect of it, right? That you should get some kind of a feed, right? It's not always, it doesn't have to be positive, right? A feed is a feed, right? And I have found that we've, at least with me, the relationship with the client is vital, because the relationship also brings one word into play, which is called trust. Without trust, it's there's always looking over your shoulder, a kind of a syndrome. So that is one aspect of it, that you get this feedback, you have a you have a relationship of trust with the client, and a very transparent and open relationship, which normally comes from you're coming from a background which has got fundamental ethics in place. So there is no issue there, right? So I think that's your question. That basically, one, that the feedbacks, and I do encourage the clients to give a feedback. We did this house in Alibag, and the client was swimming there. This is the managing director of Walker, and he called me. He says, Kamal, it is surreal because the way light is changing. And then I had my photographer who said that, Kamal, I won't speak to you now, because every 3 to 4 minutes, the light has changed. So I will not be able to get the shot. Now, the light filtering through the trees and so on and so forth. Now, so you can't actually, as an architect, you can't take credit for this. You can say that, well, there is a sun and there are trees. But then what nature does, it does far more than what you can visualize.
There's a very interesting question, Viren, because the 3 projects in question, I think one of the projects, the architect and the client, this happens to be the same, right? So I won't get into that one, but as far as the other 2 go, I think one of the reasons I think he also said that we have a very good relationship with clients is ethics and trust. I think when people know deep down inside
that there is no vested interest or no personal agenda, and that someone is truly working for a common good, right? Sometimes that common good may actually contradict the client's good and may even contradict our good, right? But it's really nice to find that common ground beyond the conventional interpretations of architecture or what one expects of the physicality of architecture to something wider and beyond. For Delhi, Manali and her old bungalow, which was the typical Delhi house, ground plus one, Barsati, a little bit set back from the street. These were the narrow lanes, the south extension to a little bit set back from the street, lots of trees growing. Her elderly father, who's a lawyer, having his office, in the front where he could see the trees. She loves nature. She loves plants. She has a farm. She grows her own vegetables. She wanted to be intimately in contact with nature, but she also wanted the house which could then, satisfy other, functional or aesthetic criteria. I think to be able to take something in a dense urban environment, and this is where nature, right, becomes central to our thinking, that whether it's a tree within the plot or it's trees outside the plot, or it's a house being too close on one side, or it's the light from the north and the east, or the closing off the west, or deep recessing the south into this kind of ruptures into the building, that if you can take what we call the utopian vision of life, which is living in nature, living in a ground floor bungalow and living in a garden, right? And to understand what is environments. If you can be in a tight plot, I don't know 500 square yards is tight, but you walked in there and you said, wow, it looked like 1,000 square yard plot just because of the few excavations, of being able to give you a sense of space, right? Of being able to interface with the street in a way that you don't turn your back on it. You question this idea of retreating into islands and away from the urban environment. You reconnect to it in certain ways. You also position and design the project in a way that it also becomes sympathetic to its perception from the outside. So it's not just about the inner, it also becomes about the exterior. And finally, you make it about nature and life, that every movement through this house, right, gives you a sense of being reconnected with the tree outside the house or the courtyard below or light coming in from the top. That living room, I don't know if you recollect, I think you came there at night, but a living room which is 16 foot wide and 75 feet long with terraces at either end is completely blocked off on one side because that's the one facing west with the harsh light. It's also where you have the adjoining house where all the balconies open up. It works very beautifully because that's where she wanted all her. Once you've taken away for running water, light rating surface, you have to think laterally as to how to bring light into the space. So it happens through tiny circular skylights from the garden above. It happens through a north light. It happens through light coming in through a central courtyard. So all I'm saying is if you hold true to certain principles beyond architectural styles or material vocabularies, right? I think that process will, without committing to a result, that process in itself leads you to a certain end result. And I think Plato said it very beautifully. He said, beauty is nothing but revealing of the truth. And that's what we seek to find. That whether we succeed or not is subjective. I don't think that we can be making those deterministic kind of judgments, but we seek it and we hope to reveal it in one way or the other.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. We have another question from Rajat Dhawan. Rajat, you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, sir. So my question was like, we as a young architects, how to make sure that we are ready to open our own architecture firm in our hometown or in Delhi or in other specific city like that?
I think it's a very simple question. First, let us understand one thing, that life is a bit of a struggle. I have struggled a lot, and even at this point and this point, it goes on. Okay. So there is, so once you acknowledge that, and I think especially if you are in a smaller town, right? I've seen excellent work coming out of the B towns and the smaller towns where the architect goes on the mobile and he does this small project. So I think the idea, if you have, after some experience, when you start to work, please work with small things, simple gestures, right? And then you can get on to to bigger and the things after that. But according to me, it's not so difficult. You have to be patient. You have to be persevering, right?
Yes, sir.
And there is a struggle. And above all, do not compromise during that struggle, because ultimately any shortcut, right, weakens you in the long run. That would be my advice.
I actually wanted to ask a question that's related to this, and this is something that we get very often from especially young practitioners who talk about this distinguishing, and this is something that you've said in your description of your practice as well, that it's an architecture of where you're talking about commentary and personal expression, right? But how do you distinguish the practice of architecture as an act of construction and constructing well-engineered structures from opportunities of self-expression? And also the fact that, isn't it true that it's the privileged few who can really get into and who have the opportunity to express themselves through their work, at least earlier on in their days, before they can establish themselves and, actually start doing what they want to do? It's a common question that we get a lot.
Okay, so I think the first, we've been asked this question quite often, right? When you talk about a physical response, basically the creation of habitat, right, which has to be linked to certain practicalities and resources. Let's loosely call it context for now. It's far easier to, and the personal expression. I would simply say this, that if one was to consider them to be two separate things and one removed personal expression, then I would argue that there would be an objective solution to every situation. That's where personal expression, intuition, experience, call it what you want, that comes in, right? There is no single objective reality. There may be rights and wrongs, but in each of those, there are degrees of rights and degrees of wrongs. Yeah. So I think perhaps it's better that we illustrate it through an example. Perhaps the best one of the most recent ones, is the house in Jaipur for one of Dad's friends, right? Again, a long-standing relationship of trust. Not a very large project, not a very large site. I think Viren's also been to that particular site.
This is the one which is constructed with stone.
Correct.
Predominantly, yeah.
Correct. Now, we've always dealt with stone in a particular way. Our ancestors historically have dealt with it as a core building material, right? Over the years, whether it be economy, whether it be apathy, whether it be availability, whatever the reasons, it has started to become more of a decorative, ornamentative material, right? And we have hundreds and thousands of years of lessons, not just in the subcontinent, but all over the world, in how these technologies can be mobilized. So when one starts to look at the existing paradigm, which is do a concrete frame building, do the infills, and then let's decorate it, right? We'll put stone there, we'll put something else here, we'll put plaster, we'll put paint. When I talked about honesty, right, there are a series of practical and ethical responses to a space, whether it be to its environment, to its climate, to its availability of material, human resource, its local skill development, to its sociology, right? And all of this can be studied historically in such depth. So for us, a project like the Stone House, or the Pavna House for that matter, is all about taking these and understanding what is the next logical step. Because this thing we call tradition, right, is perceived of or positioned as this ossified, static frozen in space thing, whilst tradition itself was ultimately a series of evolutions and innovations. So and I think it is a responsibility, or it is our responsibility collectively to ask ourselves that is there a next evolutionary step, because there always is. Change is constant, evolution is constant. So it's really an attitude that is as simple as that. And then those two things of so-called objective or practical response versus self-expression, they fuse into one. Because if you leave your baggage behind and you look at a situation, you simply start to see, okay, there's stone. If I had to build this house without bringing a concrete mixer to site, or without putting steel on site, right? How would I build it? And suddenly you're left wondering that, okay, who on earth is going to engineer this place? Does formal engineering even have the bandwidth to deal with this kind of subject, right? On the other hand, you have the quarry, which is 45 minutes away. You have the villagers who've been for generations developing this, being able to work with stone, to be able to work with their hands. So there's an extreme accumulated and embedded intelligence right next to you. You pull the mistri out, right? He brings his people and they're sitting here and butting heads with the engineer, right? Formal engineering, intuitive, generational, ground up knowledge. And you see all these amazing processes at work. And then when you understand that you can actually build a house in solid stone, a basement plus 3 levels in India at a cost which is the same or less than building a concrete frame structure and cladding it in 25mm stone and painting the inside. You don't have a square centimeter of paint. You don't have a square centimeter of false ceiling. You're working with these solid blocks of stone with cavities, with vaults, with these gigantic slabs, cutting reveals and door jambs into stone, things that would be considered absolutely absurd, insane, and undoable in the industrialized and developed world. And you can do it at a cost that is lower than building industrially, right? Suddenly it seems natural and obvious. And I think that's fundamentally, that is central to our cause, that when you do something, it should finally feel natural to the situation. It shouldn't feel enforced.
Okay. We have a question from Harsh. Harsh, if you're here, would you like to unmute yourself and ask? Else I can read it out. Is Harsh here?
Hi.
Okay, here.
Okay. Hi, Arjun. This is Harsh from Neurosis. So, we're also a family business, and I just wanted to bring a question to the, in this domain and ask you that, tell us a bit about your early days when you joined the company. I think the DNA was already set and working for you, but how did you tackle those, minute differences that you may have had with your father from time to time? Follow-up question is that, where did you get your love for, classic furniture pieces? Does it come from the senior, or is it something that you sort of found along the way and so you developed?
I think the second question is, hi Harsh, how are you? I'll take the second question first. And I think it's a logical extension of what we've spoken of. One of the reasons you find a certain inclination towards classic furniture. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? I perhaps have gotten into or been interested in social or political discourse for not more than the last 8 to 10 years. Perhaps it's a bit late, but better late than never, right? And the more I read, I find that the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the engagement or the link between the creative professions, those who challenge the status quo, and rebellion or political thinking or political discourse, one fed off the other. I kind of feel that we've lost a little bit of that, recently. I think there's a lot of design for design's sake and art for art's sake, and I don't music for music's sake, and movies for entertainment's sake, right? I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but somehow I found, at least going back into history and reading more about those times and looking at what was produced and what was made then, I think there was a incredible convergence and reaction to very, very real situations that impacted our human environments at the time. And I don't know if that's, whether it's purely an aesthetic thing, but there's something about the stories and the people and their stories that led to an act of creation or an act of production that just, look, as an architect, you're
you're seduced by stories. You create narrative. You're a storyteller yourself. So obviously these things appeal to you in many ways. I can't stop, looking at Breuer's, Vasily Chair, or Corbusier's Chaise Longue. There are so many, or Lina Bobardi's. They were just produced in such an rich, diverse, and I would say charged environment that it's hard to, focus one's gaze away from it. The other part is quite simple. My dad was a benevolent mentor. There wasn't that much friction. In fact, the friction, look, at the time, how could there be that much friction? You're talking about, there and there. I mean, it's like me trying to have a conversation in literature with Salman Rushdie. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. Right? So at the time, there was not that much space for debate because we were coming from two different places. There was a world of experience. I think, if anything, the debate and discussion is getting more and more acute as time goes on, right? Dealt with constructively and dealt with gracefully. But, the balance is, the balance is evening out a little. And that's a function of time. It's not something that you can contrive or construct. It just happens.
That's nice. Thanks. But I just want to add to that. I'm very much inclined in history as well, and I think it's also like the way people consumed pieces of furniture earlier. I mean, let's say, for example, China didn't exist at that point, at least in furniture market, right? I mean, if you see violins or pianos, it's a different story, but the consumption has just changed, and the way Europe is getting threatened has changed. So I think there's a sense of nostalgia that you see in sort of those classic pieces, and it's nice that you sort of admire it. And I work with a lot of designers, and I think you're one of the few guys that sort of identifies it and admires it and sort of values it as well. All three have to come in sort of cohesiveness to sort of work. Otherwise, you admire it, then you don't want to pay for it. Then you like it, but you want the duplicate, etc. So I think you got a perfect balance of all of those three things. That's really good. And we're very fortunate to have that. I think some strong sort of support like that within the fraternity. It's good.
Idealistic, doesn't always happen, but we can always hope.
Yeah, that's good. At least the intention is in the right place. That's fine. That works. Thank you.
Cheers, Harish.
I want to add to this, or actually ask, Arjun, you said at that point, there was, Mr. Malik was here and you were here. And so now, given that it's a sort of, it's based on time will always have that constant gap, right? What is it now?
I'm going to quote a writer I love with respect to time. I think on a long enough timeline, the survival rate for everyone drops to 0, right? Time balances things out, right? Obviously, there are still, wells to be explored, but I just feel I can have a different conversation with my father now than I could have maybe, 15 years ago. My education was completely inverted because I didn't have the same, because I didn't start off with that passion for architecture. And I think, we always associate architecture with kind of radical thought and very strong, often, partisan views about things. I didn't start off conventionally. So my entire process has almost been inverted. It's only been in the last 10 or 12 years where I started to even peel back the surface of writings and texts and theory. And I've begun to travel. I've been very, very inspired both by my dad and by Viren to make sure that once or twice a year I disappear on my own to just get lost in cities or, whether it be historical, ancient architecture, contemporary architecture. One of the most incredible experiences I had recently, I was in Barcelona. We had gone with the Mehras of Jacquard, and there were quite a few architects, including a few from Delhi. There was, I think, Saurabh was there and Sandeep Khosla was there. A lot of people that we know and are close friends. And on a particular day, right, we stepped out in the morning and we went to the Miro Foundation. And it's housed in a building by Jose Luis Sert. It's an incredible building. And you got to experience this amazing art in this amazing space. And you also got to see the foundations behind the art, which was so closely linked to the process of rebellion and the political process at the time, right? You see it in Picasso's work, you see it in Miro's work. You got to see art as genuine commentary. So we left the Miro Foundation, drove down the hill, and then we stopped at the Barcelona Pavilion, right? And I think Saurabh Gupta has been there like 1,000 times, and he was still falling down and kind of rolling
like
around the
Mecca
ground,
for him.
kissing the ground, you know. So that was amazing. And then in the evening, we went to a Barcelona football game and watched Messi, right? So the 3 M's in a single day. How do you articulate or describe any of this? I mean, what does it bring to you? What does it give you? What do you take away from that? You can't. And these situations have been happening repeatedly, whether it's in Verona or in Lyon. You just start to, to go to Rome and spend the morning at the Maxi, and then somehow whilst walking through, the forum, you land up at this amazing small museum housed in Trajan's old marketplace overlooking the Imperial Forum. And then they have a digital exhibition which starts at 10:30 at night and goes on till 3 in the morning in an old administrative building in Rome, where I was literally walking through these dark rooms for 2 hours and there was not a single person there. Look, it's people, it's space, it's experience. It's pointless even trying to map what this does to you as a person. You know, somewhere laterally, it transforms you. It disrupts, it unbalances, and you find a new equilibrium in all of this, and it starts to come out somewhere, hopefully.
And I have to say that, we all feel that time is very technical and things don't, the gaps don't get covered. But I do feel that as time goes by, things start to converge, our relationships start to tighten, and our experiences start to speak. And in that light, I also wanted to, and I'm probably going to wrap up now. We've been on for 2.5 hours.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. I pity you.
You don't realize it when you're having fun, right? Time goes by quickly. But to kind of wrap up, I want to touch upon the idea of now there is a 40-year-old practice, right? And it's established itself. It's done some unbelievable work, and it continues to do that. What is the kind of legacy that you're looking at? Is there something that, Mr. Malik, you have in mind that, this is the kind of legacy that you want Malik Architecture to have? Arjun, is it something that, you look at it in a particular way, saying that you want to extend it? Or what is the vision going ahead?
For me, I think life is footprints in the sand. So let Arjun pick up the threads.
From personal experience, Mrinalini, let me, it's quite difficult to get sucked onto the ambition train, right? It's natural human instinct to want, to consume, right? So when I came back from Colombia and we finished the first Alibag house, and that was the first time something I had done got published on the cover of a magazine, and I was thrilled. I was looking forward to it. And, each step along the way, the documentation, receiving the photographs, submitting them, getting published. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And then it happened a second time and a third time. And then the novelty wore off, right? And then something else happened and you felt completely satisfied. And then the novelty wore off, right? And as you take each of these steps, you begin to realize that, is this what a Pritzker Prize winner feels like? Is it that it's fantastic for those moments and it's fantastic for a while, and then you just feel that, what next, right? I kind of get that sense. I think the best thing we can do, the most honest thing we can do, is to simply be in the here and the now, do whatever we can, be as honest and ethical as we can in the moment, love every moment of it, good, bad, ugly, whatever it is. I think these words like legacy are very, very weighty terms. And I think it's irresponsible to be talking about them in the process of being, right? I think time and history will say whatever it has to. It's not our concern. We can't control it. We shouldn't be concerned about it. I think the idea for us is to be, to be joyous in what we do, to go to sleep, to be able to sleep peacefully, to be able to wake up enthusiastic, transformed, ready to go again, to not be jaded, right? I think the rest of it will, whatever has to happen will happen. It's pointless. These milestones, these ambitions, at least from the little experience that I've had, whether it be in the, in academics or in practice or in sport or whatever, right? They're pointless. I quote a very famous, coach of mine who basically says, victory makes you foolish, right? You learn so much more in defeat and failure. It's just,
or everything is transient.
Yeah.
I think that should sum it.
I would have loved to cap this off with drawings from 3 generations of the Maliks. Is that going to be possible?
Yes, I'll quickly show you what my little guy has been doing. So, a 7-year-old kid, he's been drawing this stuff, looking at a book,
That
of course.
is incredible.
But no pencil, no tracing. He's drawing these first lines with pen, right? And he just sits there and keeps doing this by himself. It's and I have hundreds of his drawings. I'm kind of photographing them, keeping them there. Parul, by the way, is completely taken up with Gautam. She calls him over to her studio. They kind of sketch every once in a while. That's Rahul Warrenberg, I think. No, Ferdinand Rousseau. Yeah, so he draws these things. As far as our sketches go, I'm not going to put it up. They're insane scribblings. We draw more to discover than to communicate. So no beautiful, coherent sketches. They're often, just
done on the backs of papers.
Yeah, discursive ramblings on paper. Yeah, we both I think ways where we draw to discover and we draw to know. So yeah, I think I have 1 second. I can pull up something here. God, the number of scribblings we've done during this.
And I believe, Mr. Malik, you've transformed from paper and pen to pixel and stylus now in this lockdown.
9. No, 9. I say. You understand?
No.
Wait. I'll just quickly share my screen.
Struggling.
There you go. So, where would we be here? So little things like this. This is, by the way, all digital. Yeah.
Okay.
These are all.
These are all on the iPad.
All on the iPad.
Viren, do you see some familiar looking forms in there?
And,
apparently, nothing is original anymore, right?
I'm not concerned by it, frankly. Yeah. I think that sense to be new and unique comes also from a certain place of insecurity. I'm not getting there. So those are some of Dad's scribblings, and some more. It takes a lot to decipher them. Those are some of mine.
It's so refreshing to see drawings that are not computer generated, and by that I mean like CAD.
Yeah, we're drawing people. That's one thing that we definitely are. I came back and was completely onto Max and Maya and God knows what. And after 3 years, I realized that it's not me controlling the software; it's the software controlling me. And I haven't touched the software in the last 12 years, apart from what I use for sketching on the iPad now.
Great. We have a couple of questions, but I'm going to kind of cap it at this, and I will take the liberty of offering a direct contact with you. So in case somebody wants to get in touch with you or has anything to ask, then you can get in touch with Arjun on his Instagram handle. Would that be convenient, Arjun?
That's absolutely fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that is Arjun_Malik Architecture on Instagram. So please message Arjun there and he can take some questions. But today I want to wrap up this session today and with a lot of gratitude. Thank you so much to both of you for taking out precious 2.5 hours on a Saturday afternoon. Mr. Malik, I think we've kind of took over your time to go and have a walk outside.
I'm go now.
Oh, okay, good. So I'm not going to feel bad about it then.
But thanks very much. It was wonderful in conversation with you.
Thank you so much. It's been absolutely exciting and exhilarating, and I want to thank you on behalf of Viren, myself, Matra, the entire audience on Instagram that we lost a while back, but everybody else who's still here.
Sorry.
No, not at all. This gives them a chance to come back and see the rest of the conversation. It is being recorded. It's on YouTube. Please feel free to share it with your network and family and friends. But I think what's been most encouraging is to be able to have an honest and candid conversation with the two of you, and to actually talk about the things that happen behind the scenes, not only the pretty pictures and the final products. And there's a process to it, and there's a journey to it, and it's always fascinating to unearth that journey. Viren, would you have anything that you'd like to add? And then we can close it.
Maybe last word from my end. Thank you so much. I've heard Kamal.
More
Viren, seem to have lost your voice in between.
very profound, like he showed it today also in his thought process.
But it came as a surprise.
Viren, your voice is unclear. Yeah, you're back. You're back.
Yeah, I'm back. This thing discharged, like in Arjun's case, the technology has a shelf life, somehow. Unlike us, we keep on getting reborn. Like here, we have 2 generations being born, and the third one is making. I'm so glad. Kamal, I've heard earlier, and in very small groups, and I know how profound his thinking, his thoughts are. But what came today as a surprise, and I'm not judging anybody here, please, I just stay away from judging anybody. What came as a surprise is Arjun speaking, and I think it appears to be very light the way Arjun expresses his deep thoughts. But I must
Beautiful observations that you shared today. And I think you moved me a lot today with your thoughts. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Till
Thank you
now,
so much.
Viren did not think that you were profound till date. Now he does.
Listen, whatever time I've spent with Viren in Delhi, in Bombay, in Lonavala, in Venice, at some obscure lake in Italy, in Basel, right? We've had incredible times together. There's a kinship here that is beyond just 2 people getting along. So he's been extremely kind to me always. Said very, very kind words in public as well. But that's not the reason why I like Viren so much. So there's a deep fondness and mutual respect. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arjun. Kamal, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Viren. Thank you, Mrinal.
Thank you
everyone.
so
See
much.
you.
Bye.
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
good night. Have a good weekend.
Yeah.
Bye.
Oh, great. You deserve it all now. Okay. Bye.